In the rugged landscape of the three kingdoms of Korea, where the fates of kingdoms were intertwined with the rise and fall of mighty warriors, there was one woman whose influence transcended the ordinary roles ascribed to women of her time. Her name was Seongdeok, and her story would be woven into the fabric of Baekje's final days. A tale of strength, love, and tragedy that would echo through the centuries. Seongdeok's origins were as mysterious as the land from which she hailed. It is said that she was born into the royal family of Baekje, though much of her early life remains a subject of speculation. Baekje, a kingdom nestled in the southwestern part of the Korean peninsula, was a land of deep forests, winding rivers, and craggy mountains. The people of Baekje were known for their resilience and their prowess in both warfare and culture. In the midst of this kingdom, Seongdeok was destined to make a mark far beyond what her contemporaries could have imagined. Her family was of noble descent, her father a man of great stature within the court, with ties to the royal family. Yet, despite her noble birth, Seongdeok was not simply another figurehead of privilege. From an early age, she was known for her intelligence, her keen mind, and her ability to navigate the complex web of political intrigue that surrounded the court of Baekje. Her beauty was legendary, but it was her sharp wit and diplomatic acumen that set her apart from other women of her time. She understood the subtleties of power, the delicate balance between loyalty and ambition, and how to influence those around her. As the years passed, Seongdeok's place in the royal court became ever more prominent. Her father, recognizing her potential, ensured that she received the finest education available. She was taught the arts of diplomacy, literature, and statecraft, skills that were crucial in an era where women had little direct power but could wield influence behind the scenes. Her intelligence was revered, and it wasn't long before whispers of her brilliance reached the ears of the highest echelons of Baekje's court. But Seongdeok's destiny was not to be defined solely by her intellect or beauty. It was her connection to one man, a man who would become a legendary figure in the history of Baekje, that would shape her legacy. This man was none other than General Gye Baek, the most feared and revered warrior in the kingdom. Their paths would cross in a way that would intertwine their fates forever. At the time of their first meeting, Baekje was embroiled in a bitter conflict with its neighboring kingdom, Silla. The rivalry between the two kingdoms had been simmering for years, and now it threatened to erupt into open warfare. Gye Baek, a man of exceptional skill and unwavering loyalty to his kingdom, was rising through the military ranks. His reputation as a formidable warrior was spreading far and wide, and he was soon entrusted with the defense of the kingdom's borders. Seongdeok, as the daughter of a noble family, was no stranger to the harsh realities of war. Though she had been shielded from the brutality of battle, she had heard the stories of the men who fought for the kingdom's survival. It was through these tales that she first came to admire General Gye Baek, not only for his prowess in combat but for his unwavering commitment to Baekje. There was something about his determination, his fierce loyalty to his people, that resonated with her on a deeply personal level. Their first meeting was not one of grand ceremony or dramatic declarations. Instead, it was a quiet encounter, a conversation held in the shadows of the royal court. Seongdeok had been summoned to advise on a matter of strategy, and Gye Baek, newly appointed to lead the military efforts, was present to seek counsel. It was here, in the hushed corridors of power, that their fates would begin to converge. As they spoke, Seongdeok found herself captivated by Gye Baek's intensity. His deep voice, the weight of his words, and the way he carried himself all spoke of a man who understood the value of loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. And as they talked about the challenges facing Baekje, Seongdeok saw something in him that few others had recognized, a man torn between the demands of his duty and the cost of his personal desires. Gye Baek, for his part, was struck by Seongdeok's wisdom. She spoke not just of the military strategy needed to defend Baekje, but of the importance of unity and the spirit of the people. Her words were sharp, her insights clear, and it was in this moment that Gye Baek realized that she was no ordinary woman. There was a strength in her that mirrored his own, a quiet power that came from understanding the world and the people around her. In the days that followed, their relationship grew, slowly but surely. The admiration they held for one another blossomed into something deeper. Seongdeok saw in Gye Baek not just a warrior, but a man who would fight for her people, and for their future. And Gye Baek, in turn, found in Seongdeok not just a woman of beauty and intellect, but a partner who understood the weight of the world he carried on his shoulders. As their bond deepened, it became clear that their union was not just one of love, but of necessity. Baekje was a kingdom at war, and the future of the kingdom rested on the strength of its leaders. Seongdeok and Gye Baek would soon be drawn into the storm that was to come. Their marriage was not just a political alliance but a symbol of the strength that could be found in unity, a union that would shape the destiny of Baekje in ways neither could have foreseen. But the storm that was brewing in the political landscape of Baekje was nothing compared to the storm that would soon rage in their hearts and minds. The challenges that lay ahead would test them in ways they could not imagine, and the sacrifices they would make would be greater than they ever thought possible. This was only the beginning of Seongdeok's journey, a journey that would take her from the royal court to the battlefield, where her influence on Gye Baek and the fate of Baekje would forever change the course of history. As the political landscape of Baekje shifted with each passing day, the tensions between Baekje and its neighboring kingdoms grew. The influence of Silla, the kingdom to the east, was steadily rising, and with it, the threat of war became an ever-present reality. Seongdeok, now fully aware of the political climate, found herself becoming more involved in the affairs of the state. Her bond with Gye Baek deepened, and the love they shared became a powerful force that shaped their decisions and their futures. The war between Baekje and Silla was no longer a distant possibility, it was imminent. And as the kingdom prepared for battle, Gye Baek's role as a military leader became more critical than ever. Seongdeok, now a trusted advisor to the court, knew that her husband would soon be at the forefront of a brutal conflict, one that would demand everything from him. But she also knew that her own strength, her own resolve, would be tested in ways she could never have imagined. In the early days of their marriage, Seongdeok had played a quiet but significant role in helping Gye Baek shape his military strategies. Her insights into the needs of the people, her understanding of diplomacy, and her ability to see the bigger picture made her an invaluable asset to her husband. While Gye Baek focused on training soldiers and preparing for battle, Seongdeok worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that the kingdom was united in purpose and resolve. She knew that victory in war was not just about military strength. It was about the spirit of the people, the unwavering belief that their cause was just. As Gye Baek prepared to lead his troops into battle, Seongdeok's role became even more crucial. She was no longer just a supportive wife, she was a pillar of strength for her husband and for the kingdom. The weight of the war rested on her shoulders as much as it did on his. But while Gye Baek was known for his fierce determination and unyielding bravery on the battlefield, Seongdeok's strength lay in her ability to inspire those around her. Her words were like fire, igniting the hearts of those who heard them. Her leadership, though less visible than her husband's, was just as powerful in its own right. The first major battle between Baekje and Silla was on the horizon. It would be a turning point in the war, a moment that would either solidify Baekje's position or mark the beginning of its decline. Seongdeok, understanding the gravity of the situation, felt a deep sense of foreboding. She knew that her husband would be leading the charge, and that his fate, along with the fate of Baekje, was tied to the outcome of this battle. As she stood beside Gye Baek in the days leading up to the conflict, she could see the determination in his eyes, but she also saw something else, an inner conflict, a doubt that she could not ignore. "Are you ready for this, my love?" Seongdeok asked softly, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. Gye Baek turned to her, his face grim but resolute. "The kingdom depends on this victory. I will do everything I can to protect our people." She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and unwavering. "And I will be here, always, by your side. No matter what happens, know that I believe in you." It was in this moment that Seongdeok realized the depth of their bond. She had always known that she and Gye Baek were united by more than just love. There was a shared purpose between them, a sense of duty to their kingdom and their people that transcended their personal feelings. This war, with all its uncertainties and horrors, would be the ultimate test of that bond. The day of the battle arrived, and with it, the fate of Baekje hung in the balance. Seongdeok watched from the royal court as Gye Baek led his troops into the fray. Her heart ached with every step he took, knowing the dangers he faced and the sacrifices he was making. She could only imagine what he must be feeling as he charged into battle, the weight of the kingdom's hopes resting on his shoulders. For hours, Seongdeok anxiously awaited word from the front lines. News arrived slowly, the messages carried by riders who had fought their way through the chaos of battle. The reports were mixed. While Baekje's forces had made significant gains in some areas, others were faltering. The battle raged on with no clear victor in sight. As the day drew to a close, Seongdeok's thoughts were consumed with worry. She had never felt so helpless, so powerless. She had always been the one to support and advise, but now, in the face of this overwhelming conflict, she could do nothing but wait and pray for her husband's safe return. Night fell, and still, there was no word from Gye Baek. Seongdeok's heart was heavy with dread. She paced the royal chamber, her mind racing with the possibilities. What if he had fallen in battle? What if Baekje had lost the war? What would become of their kingdom, and what would become of her? But then, in the early hours of the morning, a messenger arrived. He was breathless, his clothes stained with mud and blood, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "The battle has been won," the messenger said, his voice barely a whisper. "General Gye Baek has led the forces to victory." Seongdeok let out a sigh of relief, tears of joy welling in her eyes. Her husband had returned victorious, but the cost of the battle had been high. Many lives had been lost, and the kingdom was still far from safe. The war was far from over, and there would be more challenges ahead. But for now, Seongdeok allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that her husband had emerged from the battle alive and that Baekje had been given a chance to survive. As Gye Baek returned to the royal court bloodied but unbowed, Seongdeok was there to greet him. She embraced him tightly, her heart overflowing with relief and pride. They had faced the storm together, and though the war was far from over, they had survived the first of many trials. In the days that followed, Seongdeok remained by Gye Baek's side, offering her support and guidance as he prepared for the battles yet to come. The love they shared, tempered by the fires of war, had grown stronger, and together they would face the challenges ahead united, resolute, and unwavering in their commitment to their people. But the cost of war was high, and the road ahead would not be easy. The conflict with Silla was far from over, and there would be more battles, more sacrifices, and more losses. Seongdeok knew that the trials they faced would test their strength, their resolve, and their love for one another. And yet, through it all, she remained a constant force, a woman of destiny, whose influence on Gye Baek and the kingdom of Baekje would shape the course of history. The rise of Baekje, like the other kingdoms of the Korean peninsula, was shaped by more than just military prowess. Behind the strategy, the battles, and the shifting alliances, there was a quiet but powerful force that held the kingdom together, a force in the form of love and unity. It was this very force that would bring Seongdeok and Gye Baek together, forging an alliance that would transcend the political landscape and become the backbone of Baekje's fight for survival. Though their first meeting had been one of diplomacy and military strategy, it was only a matter of time before their bond deepened, becoming more than just a partnership of necessity. For Seongdeok, the marriage to Gye Baek was not merely an alliance for political stability, it was the union of two like-minded souls, each driven by a sense of duty and a burning desire to protect their kingdom. For Gye Baek, it was a match that had the potential to strengthen not only his position as a military leader but also the kingdom's spirit. The court of Baekje was no stranger to political marriages. Such unions were common among the nobility, used to secure allegiances, maintain peace, and ensure the prosperity of the kingdom. However, the union between Seongdeok and Gye Baek was not simply a transactional marriage. There was genuine affection between them, and this bond would prove to be essential as the kingdom faced external threats. Both were aware that their roles in this union went beyond the personal, they were now the faces of Baekje's strength and survival. Seongdeok's marriage to Gye Baek was arranged by her father, who saw the strategic importance of such a union. He knew that Gye Baek's position in the military, his status as a hero of the kingdom, and his deep commitment to Baekje's survival made him an ideal match for his daughter. Seongdeok, despite her status as a royal, was not a woman who placed her happiness above duty. She understood the weight of the alliance, and she saw in Gye Baek not only a strong protector but a man whose values aligned with her own. Their marriage ceremony was a quiet affair, held not in the grand halls of the royal palace, but in a small, intimate setting befitting their humble, yet extraordinary bond. The wedding was attended by the closest family members and political allies, but it was a moment of personal significance for Seongdeok and Gye Baek. The quiet vows exchanged between them marked the beginning of a partnership that would endure the many battles and challenges ahead. After the ceremony, as they stood together hand in hand, looking out over the kingdom they had both sworn to protect, Gye Baek turned to Seongdeok and spoke words that would forever define their relationship. "We fight for more than just our kingdom," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "We fight for the future of Baekje, for the people who believe in us. And I promise you, Seongdeok, I will not falter." Seongdeok gazed into his eyes, feeling the depth of his words and the weight of their meaning. She understood the sacrifices that lay ahead, and she knew that she too would need to be strong. "And I will be by your side every step of the way," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Together we will protect Baekje and each other." In the days that followed, their union grew stronger. Gye Baek, now more than just a military leader but a husband, found a new sense of resolve. Seongdeok, whose political savvy and understanding of the court's intricacies had long been valued, became an even more trusted advisor to her husband, while Gye Baek led the military preparations for the inevitable war with Silla. Seongdeok worked behind the scenes to ensure that the political landscape remained stable and that Baekje's allies were kept close. Their partnership was one of balance. Seongdeok brought wisdom, compassion, and an unshakable belief in the unity of their people, while Gye Baek brought strength, valor, and the drive to protect his kingdom with everything he had. Together, they formed a formidable alliance that would prove to be critical as the war with Silla drew closer. One of the key moments in their early marriage was the strategic planning of Baekje's defense. While Gye Baek focused on military tactics, Seongdeok advised him on the importance of maintaining morale among the troops. She understood that the soldiers needed more than just weapons and training. They needed a sense of purpose, a belief that their fight was for something greater than themselves. Seongdeok was instrumental in organizing gatherings where the soldiers could hear stories of Baekje's glorious past, reminding them of the kingdom's strength and resilience. As the days passed and the tension between Baekje and Silla escalated, Seongdeok's role in the court became even more crucial. She took on the task of strengthening diplomatic ties with neighboring kingdoms, ensuring that Baekje would not face the war alone. Through her efforts, Baekje managed to secure the support of the Tang dynasty, a powerful ally that would provide much-needed military aid in the coming battles. But it was not just her political prowess that made Seongdeok so invaluable. It was her ability to keep the people's spirits high in the face of such uncertainty. She spent countless hours visiting the common people of Baekje, listening to their concerns and offering words of encouragement. Her presence among them reminded them of the royal family's commitment to their well-being and their future. Meanwhile, Gye Baek's military campaign was beginning to take shape. As the general who had led Baekje's forces through countless skirmishes, he knew that the upcoming war with Silla would be their greatest challenge yet. The Silla kingdom, with its alliance with the Tang dynasty, was a formidable opponent, but Gye Baek was undeterred. With Seongdeok's support, he was able to rally the troops, sharpen their tactics, and prepare them for the battles ahead. In those quiet moments before the storm of war, Seongdeok and Gye Baek would often stand together, looking out over the fields where Baekje's soldiers trained, knowing that the fate of their kingdom rested in their hands. Though they both understood the dangers ahead, their love for one another and their shared commitment to Baekje made them stronger. And so the stage was set. Baekje, under the leadership of Gye Baek and with the unwavering support of Seongdeok, stood ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. They knew that the war with Silla was inevitable, but they also knew that, together, they would give everything to ensure that Baekje's legacy would survive. As the drums of war beat louder and louder, Baekje stood on the precipice of a battle that would define its future. The once thriving kingdom, with its rich culture and proud history, now found itself locked in a fierce struggle for survival against Silla, the kingdom to the east, which had long coveted Baekje's strategic position and wealth. The alliance between Silla and the mighty Tang dynasty made them a formidable force, and the war between the two kingdoms seemed inevitable. Gye Baek, now the chief military commander of Baekje, knew the stakes of the coming war all too well. His name was already famous throughout the kingdom as a warrior of unparalleled skill and courage. His past victories in smaller skirmishes had earned him the trust of his men and the respect of his people. But as he prepared for the larger war with Silla, he understood that this would be his most difficult challenge yet. The Silla forces, bolstered by the might of Tang, would not be easily defeated. He would need every bit of his military genius, every ounce of his resolve, and every resource Baekje could muster to stand a chance. Seongdeok, for her part, was not merely a bystander in this war. Though her role was not on the battlefield, her influence was felt in every corner of Baekje. She knew that the fate of the kingdom rested not just on Gye Baek's shoulders but on the morale of the people. Her ability to rally the spirits of the people, to inspire them with words of hope and resolve, was perhaps her most important contribution in the early stages of the war. While Gye Baek organized his forces, carefully devising tactics and strategy for the coming conflict, Seongdeok took to the royal court, ensuring that the political and diplomatic landscape was stable. Her efforts to keep alliances strong, particularly with the Tang dynasty, were crucial in maintaining the flow of military aid and resources to Baekje. But as much as she was a political strategist, Seongdeok was also a symbol of strength and unity for the people. She visited the soldiers, spoke to their families, and even met with local leaders, reminding them of the sacrifices that were required for the greater good of the kingdom. The early months of the war were filled with both triumphs and tragedies. Gye Baek's forces achieved several early victories, repelling Silla's advances along the border and proving their military might. But the war was long, and the Silla forces were relentless. As each battle raged on, Gye Baek felt the weight of the kingdom's survival pressing heavily on him. Every victory was hard-won, and every loss was felt deeply by the people of Baekje. Seongdeok, watching from the royal court, saw her husband's struggles more clearly than anyone else. She could see the toll the war was taking on him, both physically and emotionally. The victories, though necessary, only seemed to deepen his burden. He would not rest, not even in the brief lulls between battles, for the cost of defeat was unthinkable. Baekje's survival depended on him, and he carried that burden with the same fierce determination that had made him a legend. In these difficult times, Seongdeok's role became more critical than ever. She recognized that her strength could no longer be confined to the court. She would need to be a force of morale and unity for the kingdom. Through her words and actions, she became a symbol of hope for the people, a reminder that Baekje was not just a kingdom of warriors, but a kingdom of hearts and minds united by a common cause. One of the most pivotal moments in the early stages of the war came during the siege of Hwangsanbeol. The Silla forces, emboldened by their alliance with the Tang dynasty, launched a full-scale invasion of Baekje. The siege was long and grueling, with the Silla forces pushing deeper into Baekje's territory with each passing day. Gye Baek, knowing that this was the critical moment for his kingdom, organized a fierce defense. He knew that if Baekje lost Hwangsanbeol, the capital would fall, and the war would be lost. Seongdeok, understanding the gravity of the situation, did not sit idly by. She traveled to the front lines to support her husband. Though not a soldier herself, she was a rallying point for the people. She spent time with the families of soldiers, offering words of encouragement and organizing supplies for the troops. Her presence was a testament to the strength of Baekje's leadership. She was a woman who had come to represent not only the royal family but the very spirit of the kingdom. When Gye Baek led his forces into battle at Hwangsanbeol, Seongdeok was there to bid him farewell, though she knew the risks he faced. They exchanged a quiet moment of understanding, their eyes locked in a shared determination. It was a moment of profound connection, one that sealed the bond between them. They were fighting not just for their love or their kingdom, but for the future of their people. The battle itself was a brutal and desperate affair. Gye Baek and his men fought with unparalleled courage, but the odds were stacked against them. Despite their fierce resistance, the Silla forces, with their superior numbers and reinforcements from the Tang dynasty, overwhelmed Baekje's defenses. The siege was ultimately a devastating loss for Baekje, but it was not the end. In the aftermath of the battle, Baekje was left reeling. The kingdom's forces had suffered significant losses, and the morale of the people was at an all-time low. Seongdeok, ever the leader, refused to let the kingdom fall into despair. She rallied the court, the nobles, and the common people alike, reminding them that the fight was far from over. Baekje's heart may have been wounded, but it was not broken. The war would continue, and they would fight with everything they had. As the battle-weary soldiers returned from the front lines, Seongdeok was there to welcome them, offering words of comfort and hope. She knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with more losses. But she also knew that Baekje had one thing that Silla and the Tang dynasty did not: its people's unyielding spirit. The war against Silla would not be won in a single battle, but through the persistence and resilience of those who fought for Baekje's survival. Seongdeok's influence, both behind the scenes and on the front lines, was a critical part of that persistence. She was not just a passive observer of the war, she was a driving force that kept Baekje's spirit alive even in its darkest hours. The year following the tragic siege of Hwangsanbeil was one of both recovery and reckoning for Baekje. The kingdom, deeply wounded, had lost many of its best soldiers, including several commanders who had once stood by Gye Baek's side. The defeat left an indelible scar on Baekje's history, but for Gye Baek, the battle had been more than just a loss. It had been a defining moment in his career, a test of both his leadership and his resilience. Gye Baek, who had been hailed as Baekje's greatest military leader, now stood at a crossroads. The war had not gone as planned, and despite his best efforts, the Silla-Tang alliance continued to push further into Baekje's territory. However, the setback in the battle did not break him. In fact, it solidified his resolve to protect his kingdom at any cost. As the kingdom recovered from the shock of defeat, Gye Baek's reputation only grew stronger. The people, weary and disheartened, looked to him as their beacon of hope. They had witnessed his bravery on the battlefield, but now, more than ever, they were beginning to see him as the embodiment of Baekje's last stand against overwhelming odds. The defeat at Hwangsanbeil had revealed his humanity, not just as a commander, but as a man willing to sacrifice everything for the survival of his kingdom. Seongdeok, ever the steadfast partner, understood better than anyone the burden her husband carried. The war weighed heavily on Gye Baek, not just because of his military responsibility, but because of the personal toll it had taken on him. Though he had always been a man of great courage, the loss of so many lives, especially the lives of soldiers who had fought alongside him, had left him grappling with doubt. "I have failed them," Gye Baek said one night, his voice heavy with weariness. The moonlight filtered through the window as Seongdeok sat beside him, watching him as he stared out into the distance. "So many lost, and for what?" Seongdeok placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle yet firm. "No, my love," she replied, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "You have not failed. You have led them with honor. And that is all anyone can ask for. This war is not just about winning battles. It is about fighting for something worth protecting. And that is what you were doing." Gye Baek's eyes, filled with doubt, met hers. In that moment, he knew that Seongdeok was right. Her faith in him had never wavered, and it was her strength that gave him the resolve to continue. She had always been the one to remind him of what truly mattered. More than the battles, more than the victories or losses, it was the people of Baekje and their future that he fought for. This realization rekindled the fire in his heart, and he began to plan for the next phase of the war with renewed determination. As the months passed, Gye Baek's leadership evolved. He had learned from the mistakes of the past, adapting his tactics and strategies. The military, though battered, was no longer demoralized. Under his leadership, the soldiers began to regroup and rebuild. The training was grueling but necessary. Gye Baek pushed his men to their limits, not just in skill but in spirit. They had been tested, but now they were prepared for the next phase of the war. Seongdeok, too, had a role in this transformation. While Gye Baek trained his forces, Seongdeok worked tirelessly to strengthen the kingdom from within. She focused on rebuilding morale not just among the soldiers but also among the citizens. She visited villages and towns, speaking to the people and assuring them that their kingdom had not given up. She understood that their collective will was the key to Baekje's survival. And she knew that, without the support of the people, the kingdom would crumble. At the same time, Seongdeok continued to work on diplomatic fronts, keeping the Tang dynasty's support as strong as possible. While the war with Silla raged on, she knew that a fragile alliance with the Tang could provide Baekje with the reinforcements they desperately needed. She negotiated with diplomats, ensuring that Baekje's allies remained committed to their cause. Though she could not match the military genius of Gye Baek, her efforts ensured that the kingdom had the resources to continue the fight. By the time Gye Baek was ready to return to the battlefield, Baekje was in a much stronger position than before. Though the Silla forces still loomed large, Baekje's resolve had been tempered by the hardships they had endured. The kingdom had learned to fight not just with its swords and shields, but with its will. The next major battle, the Battle of Daejin, would be a crucial turning point in the war. Unlike previous battles, Gye Baek approached this one with a new strategy, one that emphasized guerrilla tactics and careful ambushes. He understood that Baekje's strength lay not in matching Scylla's superior numbers, but in using the kingdom's terrain to its advantage. Gye Baek knew the land better than anyone, and he used that knowledge to stage surprise attacks that caught the Scylla forces off guard. The battle was hard-fought, but Gye Baek's tactics proved to be successful. For the first time in months, Baekje was able to inflict a significant defeat on Scylla. The victory at Daejin boosted the morale of the people and the military. It was a much-needed triumph, one that showed the kingdom that they could still hold their ground against the might of their enemies. However, even in the wake of this victory, Gye Baek did not allow himself to rest. He knew that this was only a temporary setback for Scylla. The war was far from over, and many more battles lay ahead. But as he looked over his victorious soldiers, with their faces lit by the flickering torches, Gye Baek felt a glimmer of hope. He had risen from the ashes of defeat, and now, with the support of Seongdeok and the unwavering determination of his people, he knew that Baekje could still stand tall. Seongdeok, too, had proven herself during this time. Though she had never wielded a sword or led men into battle, her influence on the kingdom's survival was undeniable. Her strength was not in the battlefield, but in the heart of Baekje, where it mattered most. Together, Gye Baek and Seongdeok had become the pillars of Baekje. As the kingdom prepared for the next phase of the war, they knew that the road ahead would be difficult. But with each other by their side, they were ready to face whatever challenges awaited. In the midst of a war that ravaged the land, leaving behind scars both visible and invisible, the connection between Seongdeok and Gye Baek was an unshakable foundation that sustained them both. While their roles in the kingdom were crucial, Seongdeok guiding the kingdom from behind the scenes with her wisdom, and Gye Baek leading the charge on the battlefield with his military genius, it was the emotional bond they shared that became the glue holding them together during the most trying of times. Their love, forged in the crucible of war, had grown stronger with each passing day. But as the years dragged on, and the war with Scylla seemed to stretch endlessly before them, Seongdeok and Gye Baek were forced to confront the true nature of their relationship. The sacrifices they had made, personal, emotional, and physical, were beginning to take their toll, not just on the kingdom but on them as individuals. Seongdeok had always been more than just a wife to Gye Baek. She was his confidant, his emotional anchor. When the weight of his decisions became too much to bear, it was Seongdeok who listened to him, offering words of comfort and encouragement. She understood him in ways no one else could. In her presence, Gye Baek could be vulnerable, something that he rarely allowed himself to be in front of others. There were nights, after long days of planning and strategizing, when Gye Baek would return to their chambers exhausted, physically drained, mentally spent, and emotionally scarred from the battles he had led. In those moments, Seongdeok would take his hand, guiding him to sit beside her. They would speak of everything and nothing, of their memories from before the war, of their hopes for the future, and of the deep love they still shared, despite the darkness of the war that surrounded them. On one such evening, after a particularly grueling battle, Gye Baek collapsed beside her, his armor still dented and worn from the fight. Seongdeok, ever the steady presence, helped him remove the armor, her hands gentle but firm as she worked. "You're exhausted," she said softly, her voice tender with concern. Gye Baek gave a small, weary smile, though his eyes betrayed the depth of his exhaustion. "The war seems endless, Seongdeok. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Seongdeok paused for a moment, her hands resting on his shoulders. She looked into his eyes, her own filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "You are not alone in this fight," she replied. "I am here, just as I always have been." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Gye Baek, who had always been the strong, stoic warrior, allowed himself to lean into her, his head resting on her shoulder. It was in these moments of vulnerability, when the chaos of the world outside seemed distant and far away, that they were able to find peace. Though the weight of the kingdom's survival hung heavy on Gye Baek, he found solace in Seongdeok's unwavering support. She had never faltered in her loyalty to him, not once. It was this unyielding loyalty that fueled Gye Baek's determination. As much as he fought for the future of Baekje, he fought just as much for her, for their shared dream of a peaceful, prosperous kingdom that was free from the threat of invasion. Seongdeok, too, found strength in Gye Baek's love. It was not just his leadership on the battlefield that inspired her, but his unwavering commitment to the people of Baekje. He had never once wavered in his dedication to his kingdom, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. That kind of loyalty was rare, and it was what made her love him so deeply. Yet, as much as their bond was a source of strength, it was also a reminder of the sacrifices they had made. Seongdeok, who had once been a princess of noble birth, had given up the life she had known to stand by Gye Baek's side. She had traded the comfort and security of the royal court for the uncertainty and hardship of war. But she did so willingly because she believed in him, in the mission they shared, and in the hope that one day Baekje would rise from the ashes of war. Gye Baek, for his part, had made his own sacrifices. The toll of war had not only taken a physical toll on him but had also weighed heavily on his spirit. The loss of so many soldiers, many of whom had been like brothers to him, had left him haunted by guilt, but it was Seongdeok who helped him carry that burden. Through her quiet strength, she reminded him that he was not alone, that the sacrifices they made were not in vain. Together, they would see this war through to the end. Despite the moments of respite they shared, the war was never far from their minds. The political landscape was shifting, and Gye Baek's military campaigns grew increasingly complex. As Silla continued to press on with their attacks, and with Tang forces bolstering their strength, the future of Baekje hung precariously in the balance. During one of their most trying times, Seongdeok and Gye Baek sat together in the palace discussing the next phase of the war. The tension was palpable. Every decision they made could determine the fate of their kingdom. Seongdeok's wisdom and diplomatic experience had been invaluable in securing support from Tang. But now, with the threat of a full-scale invasion looming, it was clear that Baekje could not survive alone. "We cannot rely on Tang forever," Gye Baek said, his voice heavy with the weight of his thoughts. "Our people must fight for themselves. We must stand united or we will fall." Seongdeok nodded, her eyes focused on him. "And they will fight because they believe in you. They believe in us. But we must also give them a reason to fight, to show them that victory is still within reach." Gye Baek looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Your faith in me, in us, it gives me strength." "Seongdeok, it is not just my faith," Seongdeok replied, her voice resolute. "It is the faith of our people. We have come this far together, and we will go further still. But we must not forget who we fight for." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their responsibilities settling over them like a thick fog. Yet, in that silence, there was a deep, unspoken understanding. They were not just fighting for Baekje. They were fighting for each other, for the future they dreamed of. And as long as they stood together, nothing, no army, no enemy, no force of nature could tear them apart. The war between Baekje and Silla had now reached a critical juncture. The previous battles, though hard-fought, had left both sides bruised and weary. The once proud Baekje, under the leadership of Gye Baek and with the unwavering support of Seongdeok, had faced defeat after defeat. Despite the crushing losses, Baekje's resilience had not faltered. Yet, in the looming shadow of the mighty Silla-Tang alliance, it was becoming clear that the fate of the kingdom hung on a razor's edge. The battle for Baekje's survival would come to a head at Hwangsanbil, a moment that would define not only the course of the war but the very future of the kingdom. It was a pivotal battle, one that would either secure Baekje's place in history or mark the end of its reign. As the days leading up to the battle passed, Gye Baek found himself in a state of near-constant contemplation. Every move he made in the strategy room felt like it could be his last. Every decision carried with it the weight of Baekje's survival. He could no longer afford to make mistakes. The enemy was too strong, their resources too vast, and the stakes too high. It wasn't just the kingdom that was at risk, it was the future of the people he loved, and the legacy of everything he and Seongdeok had fought for. Seongdeok, as always, was his anchor. She could see the toll that the war had taken on him, physically and mentally. His once pristine armor, now dulled and battered from the constant battles, reflected the weariness that had taken root in his heart. But Seongdeok was resolute. She had always been the one to remind him of his strength when he doubted himself, to remind him of the dream they both shared, the dream of a peaceful, united Baekje. She knew that the upcoming battle would be his greatest test yet, and she could only hope that the strength of their bond would be enough to guide them through. It was a quiet evening before the battle, when Gye Baek stood at the edge of the palace, looking out at the mountains that surrounded the kingdom. The wind blew gently, rustling the leaves of the trees, and for a moment, it almost felt as if time had stopped. But even in this brief moment of peace, Gye Baek's mind was consumed with the weight of the war. "Do you ever wonder if this will all end in vain?" Gye Baek asked softly, more to himself than to Seongdeok, who stood beside him, her presence a calming force amidst the storm. Seongdeok did not answer immediately. She stood by his side looking out over the landscape before finally turning to face him. Her eyes were steady, her gaze unwavering. "We cannot know what the future holds," she said softly, "but we can know that we have given everything. Every victory, every defeat has led us to this moment, and this moment is ours to shape." Her words resonated deeply with Gye Baek. He had always known that the future was uncertain. But he had also known that the only way to ensure a future worth fighting for was to fight with everything he had. He had seen the courage of his men, heard the unwavering faith of his people, and felt the strength of Seongdeok's love and support. And he knew, deep down, that Baekje could not fall while the heart of its people still beat strong. The morning of the battle arrived, and with it a tense silence that hung heavy in the air. The kingdom had rallied, the soldiers prepared, and Gye Baek stood at the head of his army ready to lead them into the fray. Seongdeok stood beside him, her heart filled with a mix of fear and pride. She had never seen him more resolute, more determined. But she also knew the risks. The cost of this battle could be unimaginable. "I will return to you," Gye Baek whispered to her as the army prepared to march. Seongdeok nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I know you will. Come back to me, my love. Baekje needs you. I need you." And with that, Gye Baek mounted his horse, leading his troops into battle. The sounds of the soldiers' war cries echoed through the hills as they charged toward Hwangsanbeil, the place where the fate of Baekje would be decided. The siege of Hwangsanbeil was brutal. Gye Baek's forces fought valiantly, using every tactic at their disposal to defend their kingdom. The Silatang forces, however, were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. For hours, the battle raged, swords clashing, shields splintering, and the cries of the fallen filling the air. Gye Baek fought at the front lines, his sword cutting through the chaos, his every move calculated to turn the tide in Baekje's favor. Seongdeok remained at the palace, anxiously awaiting word from the front lines. The hours seemed to stretch into eternity as she paced the royal court, praying for Gye Baek's safe return. Her mind raced with worry, each minute feeling like a lifetime. She knew that her husband was in the heart of the battle, and though she trusted his skill and leadership, she could not help but fear the worst. What if this battle was their last? At long last, a rider arrived, covered in dust and blood, bearing news of the outcome. Seongdeok's heart stopped as she saw the rider approach, her fear mounting. The rider dismounted quickly, his face grim. "Tell me," Seongdeok demanded, her voice trembling. "The battle. It is over," the rider said, his words heavy. "Baekje has won. General Gye Baek. He led us to victory." The words were like a balm to Seongdeok's soul. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding, and tears welled up in her eyes. Baekje had survived, at least for now. Her love, her husband had led them through the storm once more. But the victory came at a great cost. Many lives had been lost in the battle. Gye Baek, though victorious, had lost some of his most trusted commanders. The toll of war weighed heavily on him as he returned to the palace, his face drawn, his eyes haunted by the ghosts of the fallen. Seongdeok was there waiting for him when he returned, her arms open to embrace him. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the exhaustion that had taken root in his very soul. But she also saw the fire that still burned within him. They had won, but the war was far from over. And so, as Baekje stood victorious, Gye Baek and Seongdeok knew that the road ahead would still be fraught with danger. But they had survived the siege of Hwangsanbeil, and in that moment, they found renewed hope in the face of their kingdom's darkest hour. The victory at Hwangsanbeil had provided Baekje with a brief respite from the horrors of war, but it was a fragile hope, a flickering flame in the midst of a storm. The Silatang alliance, though temporarily slowed by their defeat, was far from defeated. They regrouped, rallied their forces, and prepared for another massive offensive. Baekje's triumph at Wangsanbeil had proven that it was not yet ready to fall, but it had also revealed the kingdom's weaknesses. The war was far from over, and the toll it had taken on the kingdom, on Gye Baek, and on Seongdeok, was growing heavier with each passing day. As the months went by, the weight of the war grew increasingly unbearable. Gye Baek, ever determined, continued to lead his forces with unwavering courage. But beneath his stoic exterior, Seongdeok could see the strain taking its toll on him. The loss of so many soldiers, the constant pressure to protect their people, and the unrelenting march of the enemy had left their mark. He was no longer the man he once was, a warrior full of vigor and hope. Now, he was a man driven by the singular goal of survival. Seongdeok, too, felt the effects of the war. She had always been a source of strength for Gye Baek, offering him guidance, wisdom, and emotional support. But now, as the kingdom teetered on the edge of collapse, she found herself increasingly burdened by the knowledge that the odds of victory were dwindling. She knew the truth. Silla and the Tang forces were relentless, and despite their best efforts, Baekje could not withstand such a powerful alliance forever. The royal court, once filled with hope and ambition, now seemed to echo with the sounds of uncertainty. The nobles, once confident in Baekje's ability to survive, began to waver. Whispers of surrender began to circulate, and some even began to discuss the possibility of negotiating peace with Silla. But Gye Baek was resolute. There would be no surrender. Not while he still drew breath. Baekje would fight until the very end. It was during this time that Gye Baek and Seongdeok had their final, most intimate conversation. The weight of the war had driven a wedge between them, a wedge that, though never fully separating them, created a distance that neither had ever experienced before. Seongdeok had always been the steady presence in Gye Baek's life, but now, even she was beginning to feel the crushing weight of despair. One evening, after a particularly brutal day on the battlefield, Gye Baek returned to the palace, his face grim and weary. Seongdeok met him at the door, her heart heavy with concern. She could see the toll the war had taken on him, the dark circles under his eyes, the weariness that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. "My love," she said, her voice soft and filled with sorrow. "The burden you carry is too much for one man alone. I can see the weight of it in your eyes." Gye Baek looked at her, his face etched with the pain of countless battles. "I have made promises, Seongdeok," he said, his voice hoarse. "I promised our people that I would fight for them. I promised you that I would never give up on this kingdom. But it seems as though the war has no end. I do not know how much longer I can keep fighting." Seongdeok reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "You have already given everything, my love. You have fought with honor, with courage, and with unwavering loyalty. But I see the toll it has taken on you. I see the man who is losing himself in this war." Gye Baek looked away, his eyes clouded with doubt and exhaustion. "I cannot stop now, Seongdeok. If I give up, if I surrender, what will happen to Baekje? What will happen to our people?" Seongdeok's heart ached for him, knowing that his sense of duty was consuming him. "Baekje will survive, whether or not you are there to lead it. Our people's strength does not lie solely in you, Gye Baek. It lies in their spirit. It lies in the sacrifices they have made, just as you have." For the first time in many months, Gye Baek allowed himself to show his vulnerability. He sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the enormity of the war, the loss, and the sacrifices he had made. "I do not know how much longer I can carry this burden," he whispered, his voice cracking. Seongdeok knelt beside him, her arms wrapping around him in a comforting embrace. "You do not have to carry it alone," she said softly. "We are in this together. I am with you always." The moment of vulnerability passed, but it left an indelible mark on both of them. Seongdeok knew that their time together was growing short, that the war had reached its final chapter, and that the end was inevitable. Baekje, despite its best efforts, could not survive much longer. The enemy was closing in, and the kingdom was on the brink of collapse. Days later, the final battle came. Gye Baek, with his heart heavy but his resolve unbroken, led his troops into the fray one last time. He knew that this would be his final stand, but he also knew that it would be the last chance for Baekje to secure its future. Seongdeok, though not on the battlefield, was there in spirit. She stood at the palace, praying for her husband's safety, for the survival of the kingdom, and for the future of the people she loved. As the battle raged on, she could feel the loss, the weight of the inevitable, pressing down on her. She knew that, regardless of the outcome, their lives would be forever changed. The battle was fierce, and though Gye Baek fought with all the might he had left, the overwhelming forces of Silla and Tang proved too much. In the final hours of the battle, Gye Baek was struck down, his sword still in hand, his heart still loyal to the kingdom he had sworn to protect. As the dust settled and the battle ended, Baekje lay in ruins. The kingdom had fallen, and Gye Baek, its greatest hero, had fallen with it. Seongdeok, heartbroken and devastated, was left to mourn the loss of her husband, her king, and the kingdom they had both fought so hard to protect. But even in the face of such tragedy, Seongdeok remained steadfast. She knew that the end of Baekje did not mark the end of its legacy. The people of Baekje would carry forward the spirit of their fallen kingdom, their fallen hero. And Seongdeok, though she had lost her love, knew that her fight was not over. She would continue to honor Gye Baek's memory and the sacrifices of those who had fought alongside him. Baekje was no more, but its story, its legacy, would live on forever. The world had crumbled in a single moment. The battle for Baekje was lost, and with it, the life of Gye Baek, the man who had once been its unshakable pillar, was taken. Seongdeok, now the widow of Baekje's greatest hero, stood at the edge of a precipice. The kingdom was gone, the army shattered, and the future uncertain. Yet, in the ashes of Baekje's fall, she found herself faced with a new kind of battle, a battle not for a kingdom, but for survival, for the preservation of the people and the spirit of Baekje. In the days following the defeat, Seongdeok withdrew into solitude. She could not bear the idea of watching her kingdom and her husband's legacy be swallowed up by the overwhelming forces of Silla and the Tang dynasty. Every corner of Baekje that she had once known, every familiar face, was now gone, replaced by the harsh reality of defeat. The streets of the capital were silent, the air heavy with the mourning of a lost kingdom. The kingdom she had fought for, and the man she had loved, were gone, leaving her with nothing but memories and an aching void. For the first time in years, Seongdeok allowed herself to grieve. In the quiet solitude of her chambers, she wept, not only for Gye Baek, but for the people they had lost, the lives that had been sacrificed in the name of an ideal that had failed to endure. She mourned the loss of the man who had shared her vision, her dream, and her heart. He had given everything for Baekje, and now she was left to carry that dream alone. But even in her grief, Seongdeok was not one to give in to despair. Her grief would not define her. It could not. She knew, deep down, that if she allowed herself to be consumed by sorrow, it would dishonor the memory of Gye Baek and the sacrifices they had both made. She had witnessed the strength of the people of Baekje throughout the war, their unwavering loyalty, their courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and she knew that their spirit could not die with the fall of the kingdom. If anything, it was her duty to carry that spirit forward. Days turned into weeks, and Seongdeok slowly emerged from her isolation. She began to take small steps toward rebuilding what had been lost, not the kingdom itself, but the foundation of its people. She made her way through the remnants of the royal court, speaking to the survivors, offering comfort to those who had lost family members, soldiers who had seen the horrors of war. Her words were not grand speeches, nor were they filled with empty promises. They were simple truths spoken with quiet authority. "We may have lost the kingdom," she said to a group of grieving citizens, "but we have not lost ourselves. The heart of Baekje lies in each and every one of you. Our strength is not in the walls of a palace or the swords of an army. It is in the unity we share. We must carry forward the legacy of those who fought for us, and build a future that they would be proud of." Though her words were not the rallying cries of a great warrior like Gye Baek, they carried a weight of their own. Seongdeok was not a leader in the traditional sense. She was not a commander on the battlefield, nor was she a queen crowned with the trappings of power. But she was something equally powerful. She was a symbol. She became the symbol of resilience, of hope, of the unbreakable will to survive even in the face of annihilation. With the remnants of Baekje scattered and the royal court a shadow of its former self, Seongdeok knew that her role was not to rebuild the political system of the kingdom, it was to heal the people. It was to offer them a future beyond the war, beyond the bloodshed, beyond the ruin. But the road ahead would not be easy. As the power of Silla and the Tang dynasty consolidated, it became increasingly clear that Baekje was no longer free. Seongdeok knew that she had to make a choice, whether to continue to resist the inevitable subjugation of Baekje by the conquering forces, or to accept the reality of their defeat and find a way to live under the new order. Her decision was not born out of resignation, but out of necessity. The lives of her people depended on her leadership, and her leadership required compromise. She could not lead them into a hopeless rebellion, one that would cost even more lives, and in the end, achieve nothing. Instead, Seongdeok chose a path of quiet resistance, one that would preserve the spirit of Baekje while maintaining the peace with Silla. She sought an audience with the leaders of Silla, not as a defeated queen, but as a representative of the people of Baekje. It was a bold move, one that could have been seen as a betrayal by the remnants of the Baekje loyalists. But Seongdeok knew that in order to preserve the people's future, she had to make peace with the forces that now controlled her homeland. The talks were tense, and the Silla leaders, though aware of her power and influence, were still wary of her. Seongdeok, however, remained calm and composed, knowing that her people's survival rested on the outcome of these negotiations. It was a delicate balance, ensuring that the spirit of Baekje was not erased, that its cultural identity remained intact while acknowledging the reality of Silla's dominance. "I do not ask for Baekje's restoration," Seongdeok said in the negotiation chamber, her voice steady and unwavering. "I ask only that the people of Baekje be allowed to live with dignity. We are not enemies. We are survivors, and we wish to coexist in peace." Her words struck a chord with the Silla leaders. There was respect in her voice, but there was also a quiet power, a reminder that though Baekje had fallen, its legacy and its people were not easily forgotten. In the end, a fragile peace was forged. The people of Baekje would be allowed to live under Silla rule, but their cultural identity, their traditions and their spirit would not be crushed. Seongdeok, though deeply saddened by the loss of Baekje as a kingdom, had secured the future of its people. They would survive. And though they would be subjects of a new power, their hearts would remain unbroken. As the years passed, Seongdeok continued to serve as a quiet leader. Her influence felt in every corner of the land. She did not wield a sword, nor did she command armies, but her strength lay in her ability to heal, to unite, and to remind her people of who they were. Baekje was no more, but the heart of Baekje, its spirit, its courage, its resilience, lived on through Seongdeok and the people she had saved. The years that followed Baekje's fall were marked by a strange and uneasy peace. Under the rule of Silla, the remnants of Baekje's people were allowed to live, but they were no longer free. Their once proud kingdom had been reduced to little more than a province under the control of Silla. The heart of Baekje's culture, its art, its traditions, and its language, were slowly suffocated by the overwhelming force of Silla's imperial ambitions. Though the people of Baekje were no longer able to wage war as they once had, the spirit of Baekje was far from extinguished. It lived on in the hearts of the survivors, in the whispers of rebellion, in the hidden resistance movements that had quietly begun to grow across the land. And at the center of it all stood Seongdeok, a woman who had once been the symbol of Baekje's power, and now was the symbol of its quiet defiance. Seongdeok had accepted Silla's rule not out of submission, but because she knew that the survival of her people depended on her ability to navigate the delicate balance between resistance and acquiescence. She had seen too many of her people lost in senseless rebellion, and she could not allow that to happen again. But she also knew that to live under the shadow of Silla was not to forget the sacrifices made in the name of Baekje. It was to ensure that Baekje's spirit would never die. Despite the outward calm, there were growing tensions in the kingdom. Silla, though willing to allow Baekje's cultural identity to remain intact for the time being, was a kingdom that valued its dominance above all else. And as time wore on, Silla began to impose stricter controls over the people, stifling the remnants of Baekje's traditions and attempting to erase the memory of its once proud past. Seongdeok was aware of this shift in power. She watched carefully, knowing that Silla's rule was fragile, that the people of Baekje still carried the flame of resistance in their hearts. She worked tirelessly to maintain the dignity and honor of her people, offering counsel to those who sought her advice and providing a voice for those who were afraid to speak out. However, Seongdeok's position as the unofficial leader of the Baekje survivors came with its own dangers. Scylla's leaders, who had once seen her as a symbol of peace and reason, began to view her with suspicion. She had once been the Queen of Baekje, and her influence among the people was undeniable. Her quiet resistance, though subtle, was enough to stir the fears of the Scylla court. One fateful day, as Seongdeok returned from a diplomatic mission to strengthen ties between Scylla and the remaining Baekje communities, she was summoned to the royal court. The air was thick with tension as she entered the grand hall, her every step heavy with the knowledge of the precarious position she was in. The Scylla rulers had been growing wary of her influence, and now they sought to break her once and for all. Seongdeok, the Scylla leader, began, his voice cold and commanding. You stand before us as a remnant of a fallen kingdom. You have done well to keep your people in line, to maintain a semblance of peace. But make no mistake, you no longer hold the power you once did. If Baekje's spirit is not silenced, we will not hesitate to extinguish it. Seongdeok's heart tightened, but her face remained composed, her eyes unwavering. She had long known that her position would one day be threatened, but she was not prepared to give in to fear. She had fought too long, too hard, for the people of Baekje to let it all slip away now. I serve the people of Baekje, she replied, her voice calm and steady, not the kingdom itself, but the spirit of it. You may have conquered our lands, but you cannot conquer our hearts. The Scylla leader's gaze hardened, but he said nothing more. He knew, as well as she did, that the survival of Baekje's spirit was something that could not be easily destroyed. Seongdeok had already begun the work of quietly gathering those who were willing to resist. There were whispers in the streets, secret meetings in the shadows, and underground networks that worked to preserve Baekje's culture. Seongdeok, though not an open rebel, was the spark that kept the flame alive. But Seongdeok's influence did not go unnoticed. Scylla, eager to secure its dominance, began to tighten its grip. The resistance that had been simmering beneath the surface began to feel the heat of Scylla's ire. The consequences of rebellion, even in its most subtle form, became increasingly dire. For Seongdeok, the situation became ever more dangerous. She had to navigate the labyrinth of political intrigue and the ever-watchful eyes of the Scylla rulers. She could not afford to be careless. Every word, every action was scrutinized. And yet, despite the increasing risks, she continued her quiet work. The Baekje spirit was too strong to be silenced. And Seongdeok, though no longer a queen, remained its unwavering champion. It was during this time of escalating tensions that Seongdeok made a difficult decision. She could no longer remain in the royal court where her movements were so closely watched. If she was to continue her work, she would need to leave, to find a place where the spirit of Baekje could thrive without the ever-present shadow of Scylla. With a heavy heart, she began to make plans for a journey to the distant mountains where she would find refuge and continue her work in secret. Seongdeok's departure from the heart of Scylla's power was a quiet one. She left with a small group of trusted allies, carrying with her the last remnants of Baekje's royal seal, a symbol of the kingdom's spirit. The journey was perilous, as they traveled through hostile territory, but Seongdeok's determination and the loyalty of her companions saw them through. Though the people of Baekje were no longer united under a single banner, Seongdeok knew that their spirit could not be extinguished. She had led them in life and in death, and now, in the shadows of defeat, she would continue to lead them. Baekje might have fallen, but its heart would never cease to beat as long as there were those willing to carry its memory forward. The journey to the mountains would be the beginning of a new chapter. It was not the chapter that Seongdeok had once envisioned, not the return to a proud kingdom, but it was a chapter where Baekje's spirit would endure. And as long as there was breath in her body, Seongdeok would make sure that the memory of Baekje, its culture, its resilience, and its people would never be forgotten. Seongdeok's journey into the distant mountains was not one of retreat, but one of quiet resilience. Though Baekje had fallen, its spirit still lived within her, and she was determined to preserve that spirit for as long as she could. The days of open rebellion were behind her, but she could not, in good conscience, allow Baekje's culture, its identity, and its history to be erased by the Scylla-Tang alliance. She had witnessed firsthand how easily history could be forgotten, how the victors could write the past in their own image, and she would not let that happen to the kingdom she had loved so dearly. The mountains, remote and rugged, offered a quiet refuge from the political turmoil of the world she had left behind. Here, In the shadow of Baekje's ruins, Seongdeok and her small group of loyal followers lived in seclusion, far from the reach of Scylla's watchful eyes. The journey was difficult, and the days were long, but Seongdeok's resolve remained unshaken. She spent her time in the mountains teaching the young and the old alike, passing down the history of Baekje through oral traditions, stories, and songs that celebrated the kingdom's glory. She knew that the kingdom's culture would live on through the people even if Baekje itself was no more. In these years, Seongdeok found herself in the role of a grandmother to the next generation of Baekje survivors. She was no longer a queen nor a political leader, but she was a storyteller, a keeper of the flame that had once burned so brightly. And though she was far from the seat of power, her influence was felt among the people who had once called Baekje home. Seongdeok never spoke openly of her sorrow. She did not wear the crown of a fallen kingdom with grief. Instead, she wore it with dignity, for she knew that while kingdoms could fall, the hearts of the people could endure. Baekje's legacy, she believed, would live on in the small acts of kindness, in the traditions passed down from one generation to the next, and in the memory of those who had fought for its survival. But even in the mountains, Seongdeok's heart was heavy with the knowledge that her people were now subjects of a new ruler. As much as she had fought to preserve their dignity, Baekje's culture could not survive in isolation. Scylla's influence continued to expand, and while Seongdeok's efforts to preserve Baekje's traditions were valiant, they could not change the reality of the kingdom's fall. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountain peaks, casting a golden light across the land, Seongdeok sat outside her modest dwelling, looking out at the horizon. Her thoughts were heavy, filled with the faces of the people she had lost. Her beloved Gye Baek, the soldiers who had fought bravely beside him, and the countless others who had given their lives for Baekje's survival. She could almost hear their voices in the wind, their cries echoing in the stillness of the mountains. It was in this moment of quiet reflection that Seongdeok realized the full extent of her role. She had always been more than just the wife of a warrior, more than just a queen. She had been the keeper of a kingdom's heart, the one who reminded her people that even in the face of annihilation, their spirit could never be extinguished. She had taught them that defeat was not the end, that even in the ashes of a fallen kingdom, the embers of hope could still burn. As the years passed, Seongdeok's health began to deteriorate. The harsh conditions of the mountains, combined with the weight of her years, took a toll on her body. Yet, her mind remained sharp, her resolve unbroken. She knew that her time was limited, and she made it her final mission to ensure that Baekje's memory would never fade. Seongdeok spent her last days writing down the stories of Baekje's greatest heroes, the warriors, the poets, the scholars, and the rulers who had built a kingdom that had once stood proud. She recorded the history of her people not as a way to glorify a fallen empire, but as a way to honor those who had lived and died for something greater than themselves. She wanted future generations to know that Baekje had existed, that it had once been a beacon of culture, strength, and resilience. The last pages of her writings were filled with her reflections on love and loss, on the duty of leadership, and on the sacrifices that had been made for the greater good. She wrote about Gye Baek, the man who had been her partner in both love and war. She wrote about his bravery, his devotion to Baekje, and the legacy he had left behind. She wrote about the strength of their bond, and how it had sustained her through the darkest days of their lives. As Seongdeok's health declined, her followers, now scattered throughout the mountains, gathered around her. They had been the ones to carry on the traditions she had taught them, the ones who had kept the flame of Baekje alive. And as Seongdeok lay on her deathbed, surrounded by the people she had spent her life protecting, she knew that her work was complete. Baekje may have fallen, but its spirit would continue to live on. Not in the kingdom's cities or its armies, but in the hearts of the people who had carried its memory forward. Seongdeok passed away quietly, her final breath taken in the mountains where she had found refuge. She was buried there beside a small shrine that honored the lost kingdom of Baekje. Her tomb became a symbol, a place where future generations could come to pay their respects to the queen who had fought for their survival, the woman who had never given up on the legacy of Baekje. Though Seongdeok was gone, the legacy of Baekje lived on. Her stories were passed down, whispered from one generation to the next, and the memory of her strength and wisdom continued to inspire the people of Baekje. Even under the rule of Scylla, they remembered not just the kingdom that had fallen, but the woman who had ensured that Baekje's heart would never cease to beat. Baekje may have been defeated, but its spirit was unyielding. And as long as Seongdeok's memory lived on, so too would the hope that one day the kingdom could be restored not through force of arms, but through the enduring power of the human spirit. As the years turned into decades, the story of Seongdeok and the fall of Baekje gradually became a part of the larger tapestry of Korean history. While the kingdom itself had been reduced to rubble, its spirit, embodied in Seongdeok, lived on through the stories passed down by those who had survived the aftermath of the war. These stories, whispered among the people of Baekje, eventually spread across the peninsula, weaving their way into the folklore of the Korean people, becoming the stuff of legends. Seongdeok's name, once associated with a fallen kingdom, became a symbol of strength, resilience, and quiet defiance. The women of Korea, particularly those who had suffered under the heavy hand of conquest, saw in Seongdeok a role model, a leader who had stood firm against insurmountable odds, who had persevered in the face of loss, and who had ensured that Baekje's legacy would never be forgotten. In the villages of the southern provinces, where the memory of Baekje was strongest, Seongdeok was revered as a queen who had sacrificed everything for her people. She was not merely the widow of Gye Baek, though her love for him was part of her enduring legacy. She was the embodiment of Baekje's final stand, the woman who had ensured that, even in defeat, the spirit of the kingdom would remain unbroken. Seongdeok's story was not confined to the hushed conversations of villagers and the elders who passed down the tale. It became immortalized in songs and ballads. The bards, or griots, as they were known in the countryside, sang of her bravery, of her wisdom, and of her love for her kingdom. One of the most popular songs told the story of her last days in the mountains, where she had taught the next generation the history and legacy of Baekje, inspiring them with the words she had written before her death. The ballad spoke of how Seongdeok, even in the face of total loss, had continued to fight for Baekje's heart, its culture, its people, its history. In the grand historical records of the time, the legacy of Seongdeok was more nuanced. In the Silla Chronicles, she was mentioned as a symbol of the fallen kingdom of Baekje. But her role was often downplayed, overshadowed by the military triumphs and conquests that Silla sought to glorify. Yet, in the writings of Buddhist scholars and poets, Seongdeok's influence could not be ignored. She became a figure of symbolic importance, representing not just the last vestiges of a fallen kingdom, but the eternal struggle of the human spirit to survive and transcend the material world. Her influence was also felt in the royal courts of later generations. Though Baekje was no longer a kingdom in the political sense, its cultural contributions lived on through the intellectuals and artists who had been shaped by Seongdeok's teachings. Even under the dominance of Silla, the remnants of Baekje's artistic traditions and philosophies, many of them preserved by Seongdeok herself, began to influence the broader Korean cultural landscape. Seongdeok's legacy was particularly strong in the Buddhist monasteries of the southern regions. The Buddhist monks who had seen their temples and places of worship ravaged during the war found in Seongdeok a figure who had protected not just the political life of Baekje, but its religious and philosophical life as well. Stories circulated among the monks of Seongdeok's quiet resistance and her dedication to preserving Baekje's spiritual traditions. Some even claimed that she had secretly funded Buddhist monasteries during her time in the mountains, ensuring that Baekje's teachings would survive even in the most trying times. The women of Baekje, too, found inspiration in Seongdeok's story. She was not merely a queen in the traditional sense. Her role as a leader, as an advisor, and as a figure of unwavering strength was a model for women in the kingdom and beyond. Her influence spread across generations of women who looked to her not only as a mother figure or a widow, but as a symbol of enduring strength and intelligence in a world that often silenced female voices. She proved that even in the face of immense personal loss and societal upheaval, a woman could wield quiet but transformative power. Though her death had come in relative obscurity, the memory of Seongdeok became central to the identity of those who carried the spirit of Baekje within them. The remnants of the Baekje people, scattered and broken though they were, still honored her name in their prayers and rituals. They remembered not just the grandeur of the kingdom, but the woman who had remained steadfast, a quiet force in the world's chaos. In the centuries that followed, Seongdeok's legacy was increasingly recognized as one of the defining moments in Korean history. As the Korean peninsula went through further wars, invasions, and unifications, Seongdeok's story was invoked by later generations as a symbol of endurance. It became a point of pride for the Korean people that, even after the collapse of Baekje, its spirit had continued to live on in the hearts of those who had once called it home. It wasn't until the later periods of the Goryeo dynasty that Seongdeok's story would receive the recognition it deserved. Historians, poets, and scholars began to formally record her life and her contributions to the survival of Baekje's cultural legacy. In the Goryeo records, Seongdeok was no longer seen as merely the widow of a warrior. She was acknowledged as a protector of Baekje's culture, a woman who had, through her intelligence and resilience, ensured that the kingdom's spirit would never die. Her name was inscribed in temples and monuments across the southern regions of Korea, where the heart of Baekje had once beaten strongest. And in the centuries to follow, the legend of Seongdeok continued to inspire those who fought for their own beliefs, for the preservation of their culture, and for the memory of what had been lost. Seongdeok had once believed that the spirit of Baekje would endure through its people. And she was right. Baekje, though fallen, had left behind a legacy that would live on for centuries. Its heart, its culture, its history, and its spirit was carried forward by the people, and through them by Seongdeok herself. Her name, once synonymous with grief and loss, was now a symbol of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit to rise above even the greatest tragedies. The legend of Seongdeok, once the queen of a fallen kingdom, had become a beacon of hope, resilience, and cultural preservation in the hearts of her people. While Baekje as a political entity had crumbled under the might of Silla and the Tang dynasty, its spirit endured through the unwavering determination of those who had survived. The people of Baekje, scattered across the land, carried within them the rich cultural heritage and traditions that Seongdeok had worked tirelessly to protect. And in this quiet endurance, Seongdeok's influence continued to shape the destiny of the Korean peninsula long after her passing. Seongdeok had spent the final years of her life in the mountains, away from the courts and the wars that had defined much of her existence. She had chosen seclusion not out of fear, but out of a profound desire to ensure that the spirit of Baekje would not be forgotten. With each passing day, she taught the next generation the importance of remembering their past, preserving their culture, and upholding the values of loyalty, honor, and resilience. As the years went by, Seongdeok's influence spread beyond the borders of the mountains where she had spent her final years. The stories of her strength, her quiet defiance, and her love for Baekje became a part of the collective memory of Korea. Generations of Koreans, both men and women, found inspiration in her ability to endure, to rise above loss, and to protect the legacy of a kingdom that had once been one of the most powerful in the region. In the centuries that followed, Seongdeok became a symbol not just of the past, but of the enduring spirit of a people who refused to forget their roots. Her name was honored in the temples and monuments that dotted the southern part of the peninsula, where Baekje's heart had once thrived. And in the schools and courts of later generations, her story was taught as an example of leadership, resilience, and the importance of cultural preservation. Her impact was felt most strongly in the cultural and spiritual revival that took place during the Goryeo dynasty. The Goryeo kings, who sought to unify the Korean peninsula and build a strong, stable kingdom, recognized the importance of preserving the diverse cultures that had once existed under the three kingdoms. Baekje's rich artistic traditions, its philosophical teachings, and its deep connection to the Buddhist faith were all carefully preserved and integrated into Goryeo culture. And at the center of this cultural revival stood Seongdeok's legacy. Her quiet defiance had ensured that the soul of Baekje lived on, even if the kingdom itself had been lost. Seongdeok's name became synonymous with cultural preservation. Her efforts to protect Baekje's traditions, to ensure that its history was passed down through the generations, ensured that Baekje would never be forgotten. While Gye Baek's name would always be remembered as a military hero, Seongdeok's would be remembered as the heart of Baekje's enduring legacy. She had been the guardian of her people's culture, the protector of their history, and the embodiment of their spirit. Even as the centuries passed, Seongdeok's story continued to resonate with the people of Korea. Her story was a reminder that, no matter how powerful an empire or how vast an army, it was the human spirit that would ultimately endure. Her quiet courage, her steadfast love for her people, And her refusal to let Baekje's soul be extinguished in the face of overwhelming odds were qualities that transcended time and place. They were universal truths that spoke to every generation, reminding them of the importance of preserving the things that made them who they were, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the last of Seongdeok's followers passed into history, and as the memory of Baekje continued to fade into the distant past, one thing remained clear: Seongdeok's legacy would never be lost. The people of Korea, regardless of the kingdom they belonged to, would always remember her as the woman who had preserved the soul of Baekje and ensured that its spirit would endure long after the kingdom itself had fallen. Her story was not one of a queen who had sought power or glory, but one of a woman who had fought for the preservation of her people's identity, for their cultural heritage, and for the hope that one day they would rise again. And though Baekje would never be restored to its former glory, the heart of Baekje would never die as long as there were those who remembered its story. Seongdeok had ensured that this would be so.